I am so excited to have Dej back on the podcast. This time, she's talking about Built to Win, introducing AAC with evidence-based coaching strategies. I am so excited for this topic. I was just telling Dej, anything that has to do with AAC really gets me like up in the morning. So, Dej, thank you so much for coming back on again.
Thank you for having me. I love anything Tassel Network, Speechy Side Up. I just love being here.
Thank you. Well, the feeling is mutual for Code Treat Corner. So, and you'll talk a little bit about that and what you're doing over there as
Sure.
we go through this and get to the end. But here are outcomes for today. So, by the end of this pod course, we hope that you'll be able to define the stages of a caregiver's AAC journey and explain how stage identification informs coaching decisions. Identify two evidence based caregiver coaching strategies that support AAC implementation and caregiver buy in. Describe how adult learning theory influences caregiver coaching practices and AAC intervention, and identify two setting specific considerations when implementing AAC coaching strategies across home, school, and clinical environments. Here's our agenda. We're starting with our introductions and backgrounds. Then we'll get into applying adult learning theory to AAC coaching, then mapping the caregiver AAC journey, evidence-based coaching strategies in action, implementing coaching across settings, and finally, we'll wrap up with some references and closing remarks. Dej, can you tell us about yourself if someone did not listen to your previous episode or is just coming across you for the first time?
Sure. So I'm Daj Mitchell. I am a licensed speech language pathologist and two-time ASHA ACE Award recipient. That recently happened. So that is just a fancy way of saying I love taking continuing education. I love offering continuing education. And it's something that I've had to really utilize in the AAC world because, as you know, we get very little in graduate school, most of us even. I'm a part-time school-based speech language pathologist. So I'm a direct hire 4 days a week. And then the other day, I am in my private practice where I specialize in speech literacy and AAC. I am the host of the Coach Treat Corner podcast, which has taken a little bit of a break, but we're coming back soon. And that's where we talk a lot about collaboration. It's all about collaboration across healthcare disciplines. And it really started out with more so about the professionals, but I can't wait, kind of branching into more talking about collaborating with caregivers and stakeholders as well. So that's something that I am excited to dive into more over there. And then I love to present, like I said, on ND affirming care, AI, AAC, collaborative practice, and I'm based in Central Illinois.
Amazing. Well, if you are here for Dej, my name is Venita Litback, and I go by she, her. I have been an SLP since 2014. I am the host of the Speechy Side Up podcast and part of the Tassel Learning Network. I am the CE content consultant for Tassel. I'm also an owner of a small private practice specializing in early intervention, AAC, and autism. And I am a student at Northwestern. I'm an SLPD student at Northwestern currently and entering my second and final year. Yay.
That went by
So
fast.
I know it really did. It did go by so fast, but still so much more to go. So I have ownership interests in Speechy Side Up LLC and Tassel Learning LLC. How about you?
I have the following relevant financial relationships. So, Univy Therapy Solutions and Coach Treat Corner LLC. And then I'm a member of ASHA, which is non financial, but I do receive an honorarium for this pod course.
All right, so let's talk about how does understanding adult learning theory shift the way we coach caregivers around AAC and kind of like what is adult learning theory?
I am so excited to talk about this because I feel like at least I haven't really heard about it in the scope of like our field. So, andragogy, which is the opposite of pedagogy, is the science of how adults learn. Typically, we've had to take curriculum courses. I don't know about you, but in undergrad, we had to take this whole course on curriculum and we learned a lot about pedagogy. Whereas, it's like how kids learn, very like content driven, very adult driven, all of that. Whereas andragogy, again, the opposite, the science of how adults learn, is something that was very like heavily studied and popularized by Malcolm Knowles. It wasn't necessarily like new when he came on the scene, but he just kind of reinvented it, reignited it. And what he did was he observed and taught and surveyed tons of adult learners and came up with what we now know are adult learning assumptions that then helped him to develop adult learning principles. And so I'll talk a little bit about adult learning assumptions right now. And these are just things that you can kind of think of, this is what we can assume about most adults in the world and how they learn, how they absorb information. And typically when I talk to SLPs about this, they're like, feel so seen. They're like, oh yeah, that's me. So let's talk about the assumptions before we get into the principles. So we can assume all adults crave autonomy. That's why so many of us have our own businesses, or we're trying to think about ways to create more autonomy in our life. And if we're not thinking it from a career point of view, in our personal life, we're also thinking about ways to create more autonomy. That's one assumption we can have about most adult learners. And I'll bridge all this into AAC and coaching. And we can also assume that adults enter with some level of experience. I think often we just, we think about how they're not an SLP, what do they know? But they have so much other experience. Like, for example, I'm not a parent. And so when I'm working with caregivers who are parents and they've had children before, I'm always leaning on that experience. Again, making sure they're not necessarily comparing their child in front of us to their other child or other children that they know in the neighborhood, but still using like that parent experience that they have or their career experience. We can always, leverage that experience that they have in the world. And this is very relevant when we're working with stakeholders as well, paraprofessionals, PTs, OTs, they come in with a level of experience that we can totally leverage. And that's something we can assume about all adults. We can also assume that adults need things to be relevant, like they need to know the why, basically, of what they're doing in order for it to stick, in order for it to be meaningful, which leads into another assumption that he talks about is that internal motivation. We're kind of steering away from this now, at least in the field of SLP, where, kids are a little bit more externally motivated, stickers and candy and, things like that. And of course, we're trying to make it a little bit more internal motivated, but it's coming along. It's coming along. Not everyone's there yet, but we can assume that adults are very internally motivated. Of course, like there's still that external motivation, but when we're talking about in the context of AAC and starting that AAC conversation, and if they're a caregiver, they want their child to succeed. That's going to be a little bit more internally motivated. And another thing that we can assume, this is the last thing, you're probably like, oh my gosh, how many things do we have to assume? We can also assume that adults kind of think of things and frame things as wanting to solve a problem. And I say problem with quotes because in the context of AAC, we know it's not a problem, right? But a lot of, and we'll talk about like adults or caregivers, stakeholders who are just completely unaware, all they see in front of them is a quote unquote problem that they're trying to fix. And so a lot of the time, starting the AAC conversation, introducing AAC is a lot of that kind of reframing this away from solving a problem and putting it more into this box of, hey, let's support this, let's not necessarily kind of box this child into never speaking again, or they need to speak with words, or let's kind of reframe this. But we can kind of assume that they frame this as a problem that they want to fix. And so that is really important for us to know. But those are all assumptions. And so Malcolm Knowles, he took this to then develop 6 adult learning principles. And I'll just kind of like give you a few of them because it's a lot of research and I would definitely go into it yourself. But we can use the way that or what we assume about adults to and use these adult learning principles like when we're coaching. And so I'll kind of bridge that research to what we do in AAC. So for example, it should be an adult learning principle that they should be involved in the planning. And I'll talk about this a little bit later in coaching. This is also like an EI thing you hear a lot about, joint planning. Adults really need that. They kind of need to feel like they own the agenda. You need to make them feel like it was their idea from the start, from them to like this was their idea. And so I think about this a lot in schools. And of course, the caregiver isn't always there, but you have like the teacher assistant or the one-on-one paraprofessional, and they totally need to be involved in the planning. I use the example of when we're trying to set up like a charging station or something for the devices in the schools. A lot of the times we can just, as the SLP, as the main provider when it comes to the device, we will kind of go into the classroom and we'll say, hey, like, we want their device to be charged every day. We have good intentions, and we say, hey, how about we set the charging station here? And full good intent, you said it nicely, but then you see that it doesn't necessarily stick, and it starts to kind of fall off, and it's never charged, it's in the backpack, it never goes home. All the things start to kind of ripple. But what if we can assume that things stick better, adults learn better when they are involved in the planning and they kind of own that agenda, and we go into the classroom and we say, hey, one-on-one paraprofessional, of course, their name, not that, but, hey, X, Y, and Z, like, can we figure out a spot where it would be best for, Joey's device to be charged at the end of every day or in the morning or whatever timing of day so that it's ready to go for the day. That's, whatever. And that alone is going to involve them in the planning. It also kind of gives them a little bit of ownership. So not only did we plan this together, they also share the ownership. So it's not just on you, because they can easily say, well, you said that and that doesn't really work. And that's not a good spot. That doesn't have enough outlets. Or, I never see it at the end of the day, so I forget. Or, that way we are coming together, thinking about their considerations because they're in the classroom all day. I'm thinking about my considerations as a communication professional. We both kind of own this agenda. And so just having that shared involvement in planning. I feel like your wheels are turning. Is there anything you want to say about that?
No, it makes a lot of sense. And I think that this is very helpful for people to keep in mind instead of just like going in and saying, okay, we're going to get this parent on board with using this device. It's really helpful to not just parent, let's say caregiver, educator,
Yeah.
but it's really helpful to know how people learn
Yeah.
and how they will actually carry out what you're teaching them.
Absolutely. And I think that that is something I try to continue to remind myself, because it doesn't matter how nice I say it, how many good intents. I think that I've like thought every scenario through. If I'm not like involving them, sometimes, that good intent can go to the wayside a little bit. Another principle that he talks about is using that experience as a resource and kind of adapting your activities, or especially in home-based setting. If you have for example, like a stay-at-home mom or something who's really loves to involve their child in cooking and all these different things. And I think we do the really good job of this as SLPs, where we do like daily routines and everything. And we like to kind of start with implementing AAC through daily routines and, utilizing that caregiver experience that they already have. They love cooking. They love whatever they're doing. Let's just using the stay-at-home mom example where, maybe she is involving them a lot in the day-to-day routines. We're using that experience and leveraging it to make this experience just feel a little bit more relevant. That's another principle of adult learning. It needs to be relevant, which again goes back to they need to know how this can be applied to their real life, which plays into the other principle of they need to feel like they are solving this challenge, solving this problem, and that it leads to an end goal. I think about this as well, not just with caregivers, but also with other stakeholders. So when I was working in EI, you have sometimes you have a developmental therapist, at least in Illinois. Sometimes you have a developmental therapist, OT, PT, somebody else, this person. It's just a lot to manage as far as collaboration goals. goes. And so when we're implementing something like an AAC device, we have to really think about this because all of these people are adults. And not only just, all adults learn differently in their own right, but these are just some of the key principles we can kind of assume across the board. We all want to have this shared end goal. And so, for example, I had an OT who shared that she just felt like the device had so many buttons on it. Now, if I would have started that conversation of, hey, this is the end goal. We want them to have, robust access to communication, a dynamic experience with communication. If there's cognitive overwhelm, of course, we'll dial it back. But let's just see. If I would have started the conversation with that shared end goal, she probably wouldn't have, been so hesitant towards all of the buttons on the device. And it probably would have it would have clicked for her. She would have saw the end in mind. And so that's something that I have so many examples of times where I didn't, implement that end goal and it just didn't go correctly, especially with parents. Like they don't know what this is supposed to look like most of the time. Most of the time we can assume that they don't have a lot of specific AAC content knowledge. I didn't use the word robust until grad school. Like that just wasn't even in my vocabulary. And so we have to really teach them what this end goal looks like. And so, yeah, those adult learning principles are something that I lean on a lot with collaboration with stakeholders, with coaching caregivers. It's something that I've learned a lot about and find very, very helpful. And that's why I continue to just share this. This is the second podcast I've been on. I'm like, I want to share this with the world.
I love it. And I'm excited to read that article. So thank you for sharing that.
Hmm.
You would probably love my program, by the way, because there's two courses all about like teaching and learning. And I feel like you would dive right into it.
Oh my goodness, I'm intimidated by your program, but yes, I should probably look into it one day.
Yeah, I think you would love it.
So,
So I was just going to say, how do you assess where a caregiver is in their AAC journey?
yeah, so this is more like this visual that you see here is I'm just a very, very visual person. If you ever interact with me, like outside of courses and all the buttoned up things, I have like sticky notes everywhere, like everything's color coded. Like that's just how I learn. And so I developed this because I know that there's other people like me, and I've presented this information to other SLPs, and they're like, oh my goodness, you need to print this out, put this on a shirt or something because this helps them kind of see it. But this is not something that's like been heavily researched or anything. This is more of the other side of the evidence-based triangle where it's like more the client experience. So I think we need to back up before I get into kind of assessing where a caregiver is on their journey. We kind of have to define buy-in a little bit more like in our brain because I feel like it's just something that we throw out and we think that we understand, but I didn't know exactly what the definition was. So I literally looked it up. And it was acceptance of and willingness to actively support and participate in something. And when we really think about it, like that's like three different ideas. That's accepting something, that's willingness to actively support it, and then there's the participation part of it. So you can accept something all day long. That's a journey in and of itself. We have parents who are still kind of actively on that acceptance journey of, or caregivers, I mean, on that acceptance journey of my child will be using an AAC device. But then we have parents who have moved into that, okay, I'm willing to actively support this. Okay, I'm on board, but they're not necessarily using it at home or using it at the zoo or, out and about. That's more participation. And so when I really looked at this definition, I'm like, that's a buy-in is a big concept when we really think about it. And then we have parents who are in kind of the middle of acceptance and willingness to actively support and participating. They're kind of in the middle of all of this. It's kind of sticky. And so this stair step here, if you're on the Podcourse, you don't see this, but I kind of have this stair step visual of we have some parents who are unaware, unsure of what their options are for communication. They've never heard of this before, moving into a little bit above that where they're curious about maybe, okay, so maybe you've exposed them now to their communication options. So they're curious about it. but they're still a little bit cautious. This is typically where at least in my experience, where parents start to say things like, will it make them stop talking? I have a lot of questions. It's just, they're moving from unaware and now they're curious but cautious in my experience. And then once they're moving from being cautious about it, they're usually a little bit more open, but a lot of it overwhelmed. It's a lot of moving pieces. Sometimes we're implementing core, like core boards or low tech and high tech, low tech backups, all the tech that's involved in it, key guards, just very overwhelmed with the entire process. But they're still open to it, like they're willing to do it all. It's just they're overwhelmed. And usually once they start to get a little bit more comfortable, they're very motivated, but we still have to get in there and implement some structure. They need a little bit more guidance, right? They're not an SLP. They need some guidance to this. And so that's when we can start implementing daily routines, making it super relevant to them. They're on board. They're doing it in the zoo, at home, in the kitchen. Usually with well intent, I've done this all the time. We're starting at needing structure, motivated but needing structure, and we're giving them all of the worksheets, and we're telling them, hey, stick all these visuals around your house and do core word of the week. And, we're giving them all this structure, and they're still curious but cautious, or they're still open but overwhelmed. And so this is just a visual that I use to kind of read into the language that I'm getting from a parent to kind of think, where might they be on this stair step? Again, not something that's been heavily, heavily researched, but something that is visual for me to kind of think about it. And I know you, Venita, work a ton with AAC. Do you feel like maybe there's even another step to this visual? Because I totally think that people can create their own version of this to kind of visualize it. What do you think about it?
I love it. I think it's super important to have a visual of where parents are on their AAC acceptance journey. I would say AAC acceptance journey.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's kind of what this seems to be. And like that motivated but needing maybe support. And then there could be more steps to that too, almost becoming like an advocate.
Ooh, I
Like
like
I've
that.
noticed that. But I'm just thinking about a family that I have right now and I'm like, oh yeah, we went through that stage. Oh, and then like we went through that one. But I think this is really helpful for SLPs, especially who are newer to AAC, to see because I think it can be discouraging when the family isn't at that motivated but needing support right away. This is like the
Yeah.
moment you introduce AAC. So I think this would also help SLPs keep revisiting the AAC conversation, like the longer they're building rapport with the family too. And I think, when you've been doing AAC for a while, you kind of just naturally see this progression happen
Yeah.
and you keep bringing the conversation up. But I think for a school-based SLP, maybe it doesn't get to see the caregivers as often. Maybe it's like a one time a year IEP meeting type of thing. Dej, this should be really, you should look into doing the program and doing research on this because
I
it'd be so
know.
interesting to see like maybe if there's a common theme in the time frame too. Like if you're
Yeah.
seeing the client once a week, do you tend to see them move from the unaware or unsure to curious but cautious in like a 2 to 3 month period? Because I'm just thinking back to my client, I've seen them in less than a year, and now we're at this maybe open but overwhelmed stage where we're
Yeah.
like going to initiate like an AAC assessment.
Mhm.
But it took some time. So yeah, I think it would be so interesting to have a time frame there that's typical as well.
Oh my God, you have my wheels turning. I'm gonna apply
I
today. I know,
love
it's so
it.
funny when you never see yourself as like a research person, quote unquote. But when you really get into the weeds of, AAC or Apraxia, you're like, there's just so much more to know. There's so much more to know. But yeah, I'm all about the visuals. And so I agree. And when I was presenting this to other SLPs, a lot of them were pointing out that there are parents who are kind of in the middle of a stage too. So that's something to think about. Or maybe they were motivated but needing structure. Maybe they dropped down a peg. Why? Let's try to figure that out. Let's consider that too, that this is dynamic. And so yeah, that and we also talked about how maybe at the top of this stair step is them not needing us anymore. And so, yeah, something to think about. And I'll definitely need to look deeper into that. But again, this is something I think you can create your own version of this based on your clientele, based on your experience. But just in general, knowing that there is a stair step to this is very powerful.
I love that. And even if you did, like, if you have gotten feedback that families kind of go back and forth between the steps, like
Mhm.
maybe a spectrum would be more representative of the
Mm,
process too. So I don't know.
I'm writing
I could see
notes.
that happening though. Like, I think that if they get exposed to misinformation, how that could
Mhm.
push back quite a bit on like the progress that they may have made in like becoming more acceptant of AAC. So, and I think also, Dage, and you might start talking about this on the next slides, but like having resources for SLPs or like AAC teams for each of these stages
Mm,
too. Like
yeah.
if they're in the unaware and unsure, here's some information you could present to them. Once they're in the curious but cautious, here's the dispelling myths, right? Open but
Yeah.
overwhelmed, how to like simplify AAC for them and like the AAC assessment process.
Yes, when I was getting into it, you're exactly right. I'm like, this needs a part two. Like, this is just
Yeah,
a
it
lot of
does.
stuff. Yeah, totally.
I love it. Very cool. Anything else you want to discuss on this slide before we move on?
Not unless it's an entirely different presentation.
Okay. Let's move on. What evidence-based caregiver coaching strategies have you found to be most effective?
Sure. So this is actually from a textbook, very heavily used in the EI world. And it's all about, like I said, kind of going back to similar things that we saw with adult learning principles. There's still that joint planning when it comes to caregivers. They need to be co-creating goals and next steps, again, making it a little bit more relevant to them for these things to stick, for it to really move them forward on that buy-in journey or acceptance journey, et cetera, et cetera. So joint planning is very, very important. Now, I am in the schools part-time. I also work in private practice. I've been in the hospitals. So I know that this is not always ideal. It was very easy to plan jointly in private practice because typically the parents are right there. But then there have also been private clients where I'm going to their daycare or something. And I've had to joint plan with not only the daycare teacher, but the parent. And, they're on different parts of that stair step, if you will. And so it gets a little bit more complex, a little bit more complex than just, oh, get everyone on board. Oh, just make sure everyone's involved in the planning. But making sure that you're meeting them where they are still on that acceptance journey while you're planning next steps, if that makes sense. And so our job is very, very loaded, especially when we're trying to do it right by collaborating with caregivers and really helping to use these evidence-based caregiver coaching strategies. So other than just planning, making sure that when the caregiver is there, and this is a little easier, of course, in settings like outpatient and private practice, where you're able to observe the caregiver and the child. But I have had, and I'll talk about this a little bit later with settings and how we can kind of bridge the gap across different settings. I do a lot of video modeling with consent, of course. Again, I'll talk about this a little bit later, where I've literally sent videos of myself in sessions with the child and showing them how I would model something or how I would do a book, a story activity using AAC, really showing them that this is a tool and this is something that you can also do at home, and they can send me the video back of them doing it if they choose, if that's the route that we're going, and I can observe and I can send them. Well, I'm kind of jumping the gun a little bit, but observation is a big thing as well, if you can. And there's ways around it. Virtually you can do this. via videos. You can do this, so you can get creative. And then action slash practice, really trying something new within the context of a relevant situation. And again, we're seeing how closely this aligns with adult learning. And again, we do a very good job of this. I feel like, maybe I'm biased, but as an SLP, I feel like as soon as I got into, and there were so many resources for it, so I feel like we have definitely jumped on this and are really trying to make it work for caregivers by making it more relevant for them, with giving them activities and practice that is relevant to them and their daily life. Reflection is very huge for caregiver coaching. Not, again, this goes back to an adult learning principle of them needing to know the why, needing to know the end goal. And so that is something that we should be actively discussing. If they send you a video, giving them some reflective feedback on how it went, something you observed that really worked well, teaching them, okay, this worked well. Here's maybe why that worked well. And I don't know about you, Venita, but I am someone that when I learn the why behind something, it just sticks a lot better. And that's just something that I try to remember when I'm also coaching caregivers, to remind them of this, because I think a lot of times we try to dilute what we do to make it more palatable to our audience. And that's fine. Like, you can use very parent friendly language, but we should still be teaching them, again, that end goal, the why. We can talk about robust communication. We can talk about giving them dynamic experiences, multimodal communication. We might not use those words and terms, but we can still make it a part of the conversation. And something that I wasn't always comfortable with and starting out with AAC, but feedback. Making sure that we are letting them know what you're doing is great, and this is what I saw you do. That's great, because next time let's try X, Y, and Z, is a really great way to set up feedback, and making sure that we are affirming them, because adults are like kids in the sense that we can still get discouraged, right? Like, when we're not necessarily doing something well or being successful, especially in the context of helping your child or your student succeed, we want to do well. And so making sure we are giving them that feedback to set them up for success, as much as the child or just client in general up for success as well.
This is super helpful. How do you envision this working within a school setting? I know you're in a school setting, so
Yeah.
hopefully you can speak from some personal experience.
Yeah, for sure. So, of course, there are definitely caregivers there. For one, I want to be super sensitive to how different family dynamics are in the public school system. That's something that they don't teach you in graduate school. You kind of just are placed there and you're like, oh, okay, not everything looks like my experience, or not everything looks like what they show on, in the textbooks, or on the slides in graduate school. And so that is something that I have definitely had to navigate. And so I'll talk about a framework a little bit later that's more for the stakeholders in the school setting. But when I'm working with caregivers specifically, I am constantly trying to get a hold of somebody on the phone. I know we don't have a lot of time in the in the school setting, but as someone who is vocal about my needs, and I crave autonomy as an adult learner, and so that is something that I try to implement into every IEP, is at least 20 minutes a month of, what is it called? I'm blanking. Consult, there we go. Consult time into every single IEP. So that is accounted for. I'm using very school language. So private practice people, medical people might not know what I necessarily mean, but it needs to be accounted into your workload so that you have time for it. So for example, like, if you have mostly AAC on your caseload, that's a way different workload than someone who has all our TIC or all, gen ed students. That's just a different workload. I'm not having to manage one-on-one paraprofessionals. I'm not having to manage the device and the device's needs, all of that stuff. So it's just a different workload, right? So if I'm calculating for in every single AAC IEP, I'm calculating for the amount of collaboration that's going to be involved, whether that be a caregiver or a stakeholder. That is going to give me a little bit of wiggle room to do things like joint planning, sending videos home, giving feedback to parents. Of course, it doesn't always work out perfectly like this because we need a lunch, we need a prep time, we're laminating all the time, all the things, but it's something that we should be thinking about with every single AAC client that we have in the schools, and how we can work within the system to get these things done. And it's, again, not perfect, but it's something that I'm always thinking about. And I'm always saying at the IEP table that you are going to be involved in this. I'm going to be calling you. I am going to be sending you a video, of course, with your consent. I really hope you send me a video back. And there are other times where I have grandparents or different dynamics where they are just overwhelmed right now. Not even open, but overwhelmed. Like they're just unsure and overwhelmed. Like they're kind of in the middle of all these different stages of AAC. Not necessarily because of AAC, but because of whatever they have going on in life. And that's something I also have to think about and honor. And so there have been times where I am keeping the device at the school for now, but they know, again, going back to that adult learning principle, they know the end goal. My goal is for this device to go home and for you to use it and to model and to do all the things. We're not there yet. That's fine. Please watch my video so that you can see how I'm using it. And so there, yes, this is all great, but we have to kind of move and groove throughout it based on those different dynamics, especially working in a school where you get so many different dynamics. I hope I answered your question. I could talk about that all day.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I would also follow up with to say, like, at what point are you implementing these coaching strategies? Is it before the AAC assessment, after the AAC device has been assigned? How do you typically do that?
In the school setting, primarily?
Yeah, let's separate it. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the school setting, typically, at least in my district, I'm having that conversation. Unfortunately, like you can't necessarily bring it up until the IEP meeting, just because we can't like make promises and all that kind of stuff. And so at the IEP meeting, that's when I'm using like my device that I have in my room, and I'm bringing it, showing them what this is, showing them that end goal, telling them why I think this would be appropriate, X, Y, and Z. And then that is where I'm starting the joint planning. Of course, I can't observe and give action and practice and reflection and feedback at that point because there's nothing to do. But that's where we're co-creating those goals and we're talking about those next steps. So it starts, for me at least in the school setting, it starts right then and there of getting them involved. And so at that point in my district, then we're doing a trial because we have devices in our building. They're iPads, but you know what I mean. We have the apps available in our district. And so the parents or caregivers, they know that, okay, now we're about to start a trial. And sometimes in the trial process, I am giving them videos of me. And once I start to kind of, depending on the feedback that I'm getting from them, I can tell if they're ready for me to send it home. But they know at the IEP meeting, that is the goal. The goal is for me to send it home and for you to use it, send me videos back. And so, yeah, I think I'm answering your question. Like that is how I'm starting it.
Thank you for sharing that. That's really helpful.
Yeah.
And it makes sense that like the joint planning would be starting pretty much at that IEP meeting.
Yes. And unfortunately, sometimes, and I totally get it, like there's so much grace and space for how busy caregivers are. And Knowles talks about that with adult learners. Like they're so busy. That's why everything has to be relevant and has to, make sense for them. They have to know the end goal in mind. And so sometimes we're just joint planning all 3 years that I see them in in my middle school setting.
That makes sense. Yeah. And I think that's where like that time frame for those steps would be helpful because
Yeah.
yeah, if you're not like able to have that much contact with the caregivers, except for those IEP meetings, then I can imagine that process would take a lot longer.
Yeah, for sure. And
That's
especially
reality, right?
that's the reality, especially because I'm a middle school SLP. In the perfect world, I shouldn't be starting these conversations. I should just be
It's true.
continuing that implementation. I should kind of have more motivated but needing structured type of cases. But again, like you said, it's not perfect, and and kiddos change so much throughout the years, and so yeah, it's a lot. Our job is a lot.
Hey, listen, I was also a middle school assistive tech specialist, and I felt like I was the busiest one. I mean, I covered all 52 middle schools by myself.
Woo!
And we did have 4 AT specialists for the elementary schools, and I think they did a, fairly good job of getting devices to students that needed it, but the referral had to come from the school team first.
Mm.
And unfortunately, like, the case may be that a kid transfers into our district around middle school time and then never had received a device prior to that, or it didn't transfer over. So, yeah, we got a lot of referrals in middle school too, and I was like, what is happening? Like, why is this child without a device at this stage? But it happens.
Yes, yes. And yeah, I try to bring up the red tape that happens so much as well. A lot of times, unfortunately, higher ups will change, like or students' abilities to get into certain programs, like a life skills program, self-contained classrooms, like things that are more set up for like AAC and learning that in that kind of way, multimodal communication. So we've had in our district issues where, not issues per se, where we're having to adapt a lot of the classroom vocabulary, classroom activities to fit the needs of our students who are multimodal communicators. And so that it's been a lot of joint planning with the teachers on my end. And you're typically the only one in the middle school setting and the high school setting. So, yeah, this can be used not only with caregivers but all stakeholders.
That's great. Well, I think we're going to talk about that soon. So,
Yeah.
how would you recommend implementing these strategies across different settings? You touched on it a little bit in the last one, more school
Yeah.
based, but what about everything else?
Sure. So until I, develop research and everything for that stair step visualize your own version of this as it applies to buy-in, whether that be in the medical setting with adults who are utilizing AAC, and try to really think about typically where are your clients starting and where are you having to move them through. I remember when I was doing like adult neuro placement, it was like usually when you're thinking about AAC, and this is just in my experience when I was learning about it in graduate school, we had a lot of pediatric examples and we didn't have a ton of adult examples. And so being thrown into like adult neuro, where this is the first time that the client themselves is having to go through this buy-in for their own AAC device. And that was something that I wish I had that visual to think about when I was working with adults with AAC. And sometimes they don't have caregivers, it's just them. And so, something to think about across those different settings. But also getting creative, and I've talked about this with caregiver involvement. When I was presenting this to other SLPs, a lot of them asked, a lot of my caregivers don't have the flexibility to take off of work for a lunch break or something to come get training on the AAC device. And of course, we have so many great things out there on TPT and different SLPs who have created resources to help with bridge that gap, but also just sending a video of you and their child with consent, of course, it really helps it to stick. It's relevant to them. They see the end goal in mind. You are actually modeling on the exact device that they're going to be trying to model on, and et cetera, et cetera. So videos are very powerful, and keep doing it. Just because they don't respond, keep doing it. If you've got that consent, continue to do that, because at the end of it, everyone wants to see their child succeed. I would say 99.9% of people want to see, their child succeed, especially in the realm of communication, something that it's just new. Multimodal communication is new to a lot of people who aren't in that world, who are not in our world. I know my parents were like, "You do what?" And you like, "You do what in the private practice?" And so we're having to make it relevant to them, make it make sense for them. And again, something else that I would implement across different settings that I think is highly applicable across settings are those adult learning principles, and trying to not only apply them to caregivers, but across all stakeholders. Because I have worked in acute care and inpatient and private practice in the schools, I find it very helpful to teach on principles and frameworks and things that can be used across settings. And so something like adult learning principles, I feel like falls in that category because, families are typically all adults, and paraprofessionals, yes, some of them just graduated from high school, but they're still adults. And so we're having to, make sure that we're thinking about them in that way. And nurses, oh my gosh, I have had to collaborate so much with school nurses. We don't talk about that in graduate school. And of course, thinking about all the experience that they bring and how, things like, or when I was working with a physical therapist on a case, and she was talking so much about positioning, and like she brings in that experience, and finger isolation with the OTs, and they're bringing in that experience. Like, we can leverage so many of the adults in our buildings when we start to think about the kind of learners that they are. And so once you are bringing in their experience, that is a level of buy-in in itself. Not that OTs and PTs aren't necessarily bought into something like AAC, but when we're making it make sense to them through, talking about things like finger isolation or positioning, it kind of helps to make it more relevant to them. But typically I don't have to have those conversations with PTs and OTs. But for example, I have to have an ongoing collaborative conversation with in an ABA facility. And that is a little bit harder because there's so many revolving doors with RBTs, registered behavior technicians. And so a lot of the times I am starting from scratch with the joint planning and the feedback and the reflection. And, that's just a part of the job, and I'm happy to do it. But being able to lean on things like adult learning principles definitely helps. Talking to them, getting a connection with them so I can learn what experiences I can leverage. I have an RBT right now who is in school for special education, and they're always like talking about the things that they're learning. They brought up, not me, they brought up neurodiversity affirming care. And I was like, oh my goodness, yes. Like, let me leverage that now in the realm of AAC and coaching. And so this is something highly applicable across not only settings, but stakeholders, not just caregivers as well. Collaborative practice. So I'm sure you've heard of the SET framework, Venita, and it's something that I haven't necessarily had to do on a team in a very long time because we don't have a life skills program anymore. But this is something that I think the principles of it are applicable across settings. Like when you're thinking about the client themselves, the client's environment, the different tasks that a client has to endure throughout their day, the different settings that the client has to endure throughout their day, different tools that are needing to help them be successful. It's definitely something that I think is worth looking into in the realm of not just AAC, really anything. And that's why I really like, I need to go back to that entire article. And I love her free resource, Joy Zabala, her entire like free resource page on her website, which I have in like the free resources section of this, and like retrain myself on this because I remember how like light bulb moment it was for me when I started to learn about it. And it was actually an administrator at my CF placement who was previously an SLP, like her previous role was an SLP. And I was super new to AAC, thrown into all these different classrooms, life skills classrooms with so many different devices. And she was like, have you ever heard of the SET framework? And yeah, so I hope that everyone has that light bulb moment when it comes to that, because it was very helpful. And so, yeah, things like visualizing where caregivers are on their journey, getting creative with how caregivers can be involved, using adult learning principles across settings, across stakeholders, and trying to think of ways to be as collaborative as you can, using different frameworks or just connecting in general with your colleagues and leveraging their experience, trying to make things relevant to them is super helpful across different settings.
Thank you so much for sharing those recommendations. I feel like those are very applicable and helpful depending on what setting an SLP is working in.
Yeah.
We actually use the SET framework for our AAC assessment process. So this particularly the communication aspect of it. So I'm very familiar with that. But you got my wheels turning. I feel like with this whole staircase, stair steps,
I know.
because I've also seen, I don't know if you've experienced this, like I've seen providers go from like the bottom rung all the way to the top in one training. Like if you've ever been, have you ever been to a lamp training, like Lamp Bridge for
Yes.
Life? Okay.
Yes.
That's a specific approach to AAC, but like it's so convincing, especially if you're in a 2 day or weekend training.
Yeah.
I feel like people move through those steps like super quickly. So it would just be really interesting to see like how quickly you could get people through those steps, like how much attention they need. And, like, if it just takes I'm thinking more of like a time frame, like how long it would take, to get somebody to like even an advocacy stage if you're only seeing them like once a month, once a year at an IEP meeting. And then like, why is that important? Well, it's important because then it shows that we need to spend more time with caregivers to get them to through those stages quicker. But what are your thoughts on that? Like, have you seen like and also I think it could be used as like a survey, like before and
Yeah.
after a training, like you could start it or even like a CEU training, like giving them a survey to see where they are in those steps. And it'd have to correlate to those steps. But then at the end of it, re-administering the survey and then seeing if they've made any progress.
Yes. Your your brain is so research these days. I
I
love
know.
it.
I know. Literally, that's all I think about. So you'll have to forgive me, like
No, I love it. I'm like,
nerding
"Man, I
out.
don't even think like this. This is amazing. You're writing my study for me. I love it."
I well, at least it's recorded, so you have everything you need to get started.
Yeah.
But it's so
But yes,
cool.
I have seen that, especially in my private practice, because we work so closely with the parents in that kind of setting where and I feel like because of the style of practice that I have, I attract people who are gonna go down that rabbit hole and all the research, look at all the TikToks and all of the things, and who are coming in with a lot of experience of their own. And so I typically am seeing them move through it, not necessarily because I'm doing a great job, but because they are so invested in moving through that step for the sake of their child. But again, I've seen it on the other spectrum where I am needing to be a little bit more like stirring the ship of helping them along this journey. But yeah, so I've seen it both ways.
Yeah, I'm okay. I'm glad it wasn't just me. Like I I've definitely observed that, so it's nice to know that like, you've seen that too, and it'd be so interesting to see like what the research would actually say about that. But thank you for sharing these resources. Do you want to talk about them a little bit?
Sure. So I mentioned Joy Zabala, who created the SET framework. And so again, on her website, she has, I believe it's like a link just for like all things SET framework where you can for free download research articles. You can download, I think she even has like a presentation on it, like the slides from it that you can download and also just the SET framework materials that you can download. So definitely look into that. I love how accessible it is and that anyone could start tomorrow once they understand it and use it with their team. So there's that, and I have the link for it. And then I have a freebie, just like a quick start guide for introducing AAC to caregivers. And it's really just conversation starters. I was listening to a podcast, Stephanie Swigart. Oh, I'm probably butchering her last name, but she was talking about how conversation starters, of course, like we don't want scripts going into very delicate conversations, but it's like you kind of have tools in your tool belt. Like you just feel a little bit more equipped. And of course, if you're new to AAC, or she wasn't just talking about AAC, but in the context of AAC, if you're new to this and you are a little bit nervous about starting that conversation, having things to kind of guide you. Of course, again, not a script. You don't have to say these things word for word, but just kind of how, so some suggestions to have in your toolbox about how to approach these conversations. And these are just based off of real conversations that I've had with caregivers. And I've tried to separate them based on like where someone is in that stair step and how I would start that conversation. Because like I said, there are some times where you have caregivers where you are kind of walking them through this journey and they've already heard about AAC. Sometimes, well, actually, I don't think this has happened to me, but I've heard of it happening to other people where the caregiver has brought up AAC to them, not necessarily them bringing it up to the caregiver. So, so of course they're already aware. They're just more curious at that stage. And so I try to kind of give you a couple of different conversation starters for those different kind of AAC moments. Of course, again, not a script, but just something to have in your tool belt.
Awesome. Okie dokie. Let's go here. And so if you've been attending some of our pod courses prior to this one, you may have seen that we provide this levels of evidence, particularly for like research-based studies. And then these are the references that Dej has provided. We let you know if they're open access or not, and then the quality of the study, you can see the key up here. But there's one that I think we both wanted to highlight in particular because it is a high quality study and it's also open access. So Dej, do you want to talk about that one a little bit?
Sure. So when I was in graduate school, Dr. Lorigo, who is a part of this study, she was talking to us a ton about caregiver coaching. And of course, she told us, like, I have all these, studies and I do all this research. And she had some research assistants and everything. We knew she was the real deal. But of course, when you're implementing this into practice, we weren't implementing it much into practice at the grad school level, right? And so, especially not with just AAC. And so, in looking through articles to help me, think about coaching in this kind of way in the realm of buy-in, I stumbled upon one of her articles and I even messaged her on Facebook and it was like,
Mhm.
I knew you were the real deal, but you are the real deal. And so she just talks a lot about like how to problem solve with caregivers and how important that is. And it really reminds me of that end goal, like having this end goal and that everyone innately wants to solve this challenge. And for in the context of AAC, that would be helping their child succeed.
Amazing. Do you happen to know if the other co-authors are also SLPs or are they other?
I don't remember. I don't remember.
Okay.
I was so like, Dr. Lorio.
Well, I see that it's like in infants and young children, so I'm wondering
Mm-hmm.
if maybe she collaborated with somebody else, but I'm gonna have to read that one. So thank
Mm-hmm.
you for sharing it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Awesome. So if everybody wants to connect with you after this pod course, where can they find you?
So my website is coachrecorner.com. And so you can definitely go there. I'll be putting some more of our episodes, not our episodes, but my episodes from the Coach Corner podcast on there fairly soon. So you can go and look through those. If you want to connect with me, ask questions, or look at some of my different resources, you can. I usually put everything on Instagram, and that's at your SLP Daj, and Daj is DAJ. And if you want to email me, whether it be, a question or for different opportunities, feel free to do that at hello@coachrecorner.com.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing those resources and your contact information. And one more final thought for you regarding your steps. I said survey, but you could also have like a screener for
Mm,
SLPs to use with their caregivers to kind of it would basically be like a survey depending on how you structure it, but to see where they're at with those stages. Because maybe you and I are more experienced with AAC, we can kind of identify those stages pretty easily, but it might not be as obvious for someone who is newer to AAC. I feel like that would also be really helpful to know if you get a referral from an SLP for, like, let's say, an AAC
Ooh,
evaluation. I mean, you would assume at that point that the parents are higher up in the rungs if they're open to an AAC assessment, but you never know. Like, some parents don't question the recommendations from a professional. So they might be like a yes family and, say they're going to use a device, but then like they never went through those stages or they never like understood the why. So they get the device and then you don't see it implemented. So yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
I feel like that's also really great information
I
for
am I am like
everyone
going
involved.
I am like going to study tomorrow.
I love it. Well, Dee, it's always a pleasure speaking with you. I feel like you're always like reinventing, thinking of
Oh,
new ways to solve problems in the field. So I can't wait to continue following along on your journey.
thank you so much, Venita.